This is True News, the news program that refuses to compromise the gospel of the kingdom of God in a world of apostasy and compromise. In fact, the topic of this segment is apostasy. Mr. Kevin Swanson has published a new book, Apostate, The Men Who Destroyed the Christian West. Kevin is the host of Generations Radio, a program devoted to Christian homeschool families. He's also the executive director of Christian Homeschool Educators of Colorado. His previous book was The Second Mayflower. Kevin is also a Bible teacher and elder in the Reformation Church in Castle Rock, Colorado. His website is generationswithvision.com. Kevin, welcome back to True News.
Thanks, Rick. Always good to be with you.
Yes, sir. And Castle Rock, a beautiful city. In fact, when my family, when we were preparing to leave Texas in 2005, I seriously considered moving to Castle Rock. I visited the city, looked at real estate. Very, very, very nice place to live.
Yeah, we're happy to be here out on the eastern plains of Colorado, a safe distance from the demise of Western civilization, as we like to say.
Yes, right there between Denver and Colorado Springs.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yep, that's us.
Okay, your new book, Apostate, The Men Who Destroyed the Christian West. The list is long, and we only have 20 minutes, so This is going to be a challenge. I looked at the table of contents. You named many historical people that are admired and respected by many Americans, men whose works are required reading in schools and colleges, yet you say they helped destroy America and the West as a Christian place. Where do we start?
Well, I tell you, they were destructive men. There's no question, and no question they were apostate. I mean, they admit to be apostate themselves. It's not difficult to read their biographies or autobiographies and determine these guys had a Christian roots. They had Christian grandpas and grandmas, but they turned away from the faith, and they turned out to be some of the worst wretches that have ever lived in many cases, and set the direction in the Western world to destroy Christianity, and I think destroy the Western world itself. It's been a mix of humanism and Christianity, but you mix sand into concrete or water into the concrete and sand into the concrete, after a while the whole foundation tends to jitter and the thing comes down, and that's what we're going through right now. Mm-hmm. These men were apostates. They left the faith, and they led so many people, in some cases billions of people, down the highway towards Marxism, socialism, existentialism, humanism, and the isms that have eroded the entire Western world.
All right, your list of bad guys doesn't start in the 1950s or 60s. You go back centuries.
Well, I think it's important for people to know the roots of it. They need to know what the philosophies were. They need to know who the men were. Why? Because there's some of us who want to be Christians. They want their kids to be Christians. They want a world where faith, family, and freedom survives. And the humanists, existentialists, those who have destroyed our world, are not going to contribute to anything good in the years to come. So it's at this point where I think the last few people who say, I think the Christian faith is cool. I think the Christian family is something that really needs to survive. I think that freedom is cool, and we need a free country somewhere around the world where Karl Marx doesn't get his hands into it. There's a few people left like that, and we need to go back and find in history who the bad guys were and understand their philosophies, and then bring biblical answers to those philosophies, and then hopefully leave our children something of a legacy to rebuild faith, family, and freedom somewhere in the world in the years to come.
All right, let's start with your number one. I should say your first bad guy. Who did you name?
Well, I named Aquinas, and I know that's controversial. A lot of people like Aquinas. Certainly the Catholics do, a lot of Protestants do too, but Thomas Aquinas, even at the end of his life, admitted that all his work was straw. But what he did was he said, okay, we have sacred doctrine and philosophical doctrine. The philosophical doctrine will be built up on human reason, and that'll be all the humanist stuff. And then we'll have sacred doctrine. We'll have both at the same time. And the Bible cannot speak to philosophical knowledge. It can't speak to ethics. It can't speak to epistemology. It can't speak to metaphysics. It can't speak to philosophy. So he separated out the secular area of life, gave it to the universities that were effectively run by the Aristotelian thinking of the day, and that set up the whole stage for eliminating the Christian faith from the public sector, from culture, from education, from politics, from everything. And effectively, it was Aquinas that set the direction for the abandonment of the Christian faith in the wider culture of the West.
And yet our educational system was Christ-centered at the beginning of this country.
Yes, it was. It was, but Aquinas always seemed to gain the upper hand. I mean, you think of Harvard University, that really was somewhat of a Christian college at the beginning. But remember, it was Aquinas thinkers, it was Aristotelian thinkers, it was William Brattle and a guy named Leverett who were latitudinarian kind of liberal thinkers that made their way into Harvard and squeezed increased Mather and the Puritans out. And they said, hey, we don't need any of this Christian ethics in this. We'll use Aristotelian ethics. We don't need any of this godly stuff. We'll teach the Greek philosophy. And so inevitably it was Greek philosophy and human reason that won the day at the turn of the 18th century at Harvard. And pretty much every university, every seminary went that direction, from Harvard to Yale to Princeton. We have lost almost every single educational battle over the last 300 to 400 years of this nation's history because Aquinas makes his way into the universities again and again and again, and I'm just sick of it. I'm tired of losing, to be honest with you, Rick. I mean, there are some people who still want the faith to survive, still some Christians left. We don't particularly like secular universities grabbing control of the thought processes of a nation again and again and again and again, and so that's why I wrote the book. I said, hey, it's time to get rid of this thinking that mixes humanistic ideas in education with Christian ideas.
Who were some of the other early humanists that played a detrimental role in the decline of the Christian West?
Well, there's no question John Locke, Descartes, others are trying to build up that independent system of humanist philosophy on human reason. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau would be, I think, a very important figure. He was a man who configured everything you see today effectively in the socialist state. You realize that governments never took more than 6, 7, 8% of the gross national income for thousands of years. In fact, the Roman Empire never really took much more than about 8 or 9% of the people's income. But you get into the 1800s and 1900s, and suddenly almost every single government, including ours, is upwards of 60%. 70% of the gross national income goes to government spending at some level, local, state, or federal. How did that happen? How do we get to the big state, the big government? How does big government that controls social systems in almost every single civilized country in the modern world happen? It happened because of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the books that he wrote, like The Social Contract and Emile, which is his book on how to bring in public education, how to bring in compulsory attendance laws into the modern world. Remember, they didn't have compulsory attendance laws until the early part of the 1800s. And the last state in America, the last holdout in America to stand up against socialism in the schools and compulsory attendance laws was Mississippi, and it went down in, I think it was 1913. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau worked very, 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 very hard to bring a socialist system to bear in order to bring about a totalitarian world, an Orwellian world, and that's the direction we're headed in today. People will say, well, how in the world did we get to 1984? How did we get to totalitarianism and communism and socialism controlling medical care and just about everything, education, everything you can ever imagine? The answer is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's the father of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, of course, a key figure later on. I treat him as well. But if you want to know, what ruined the modern world and why we're heading towards totalitarianism, you need to study my book, Apostate. You need to get a copy and read about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, by the way, was a madman, insane. He abandoned 5 of his children on the steps of an orphanage the day they were born to die there on the steps of an orphanage. He was a wretch. He was one of the most horrible, wicked men who have ever lived. But he was also generally, I think, widely considered the mastermind behind the modern world.
Lots of times when you study these people that are revered in history, you find out they are creeps.
They are.
They were creeps. There was nothing good about them.
They're terrible. Many of them were demon-possessed. Some of them killed their kids. Marx starved 2 or 3 of his children to death. One of his daughters married a Satanist, and his last 2 surviving daughters committed suicide shortly after his death. No, these guys' lives were hell on earth. They were some of the worst men who ever lived, and yet they had tremendous influence over billions of people around the globe. People don't understand the kinds of people that have had incredible influence. I call it a Nephilim influence or gigantic influence upon the minds and hearts and lives of billions of people around the globe. But I just think that somebody needs to bring out this expose, and at the very least, it's an interesting story. People tell me over and over, my book's a page turner. It's impossible to put it down. But if you want to know what made the modern world and the wretches that brought about the hell on earth we see in most Western nations today, you got to get a copy of my book, Apostate.
You know, it's like this is somewhat off topic, but Alfred Kinsey, Dr. Alfred Kinsey, he is recognized as the father of modern sex education. And psychology schools revere him, and he's taught, his works are taught in colleges and universities. The U.S. government still funds, work as based on his research. But Kinsey was a demented, twisted, sick, sexual pervert.
He was a glorified child molester.
He was a pedophile.
Yeah.
He was a worthless piece of you-know-what. And yet he's edified and glorified as this brilliant man. He was trash. He was human trash. Mm-hmm. And why? Why do we as Christians have this stuff infected in our minds? Why aren't we telling the world, no, that man you are revering was absolutely despicable?
Yeah, I think it's because we've been
brainwashed
by these leaders.
Brainwashed, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus said something important, and I treat this in my book. Jesus Christ said concerning prophets, false prophets, and the philosophers, and people who teach and lead many, many people astray, by their fruits you shall know them. And that's really important. That's why I bring out all the biographies. I think it's important to know these biographies in order to know the evil of these men and the evil fruits that they produced by way of their teaching.
Now, anybody that went to high school or college read the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. How did he get on your list?
Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of the key apostates of the 19th century. I mean, he would admit himself to be somebody who's not a Christian. He was not even a Unitarian. He was a transcendentalist. He pretty much left Unitarianism behind and developed a religion that was largely based in Eastern mysticism. His aunt taught him the Bhagavad Gita, so he had a strong Eastern mystical worldview that infected him, and he wound up affecting hundreds of millions of people in America as well, with an idea, a viewpoint that glorified self and turned man into his own source of truth and man into his own God. He was the guy who came up with the phrase "follow your heart," which you hear everywhere. The Bible says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And we're not to follow our hearts. We're to follow the Word of God and be corrected by the Word of God constantly, because our hearts are nothing to be trusted. But Emerson was one who said, you could just make it up as you go along, and everybody effectively makes up their own religion, their own truth as they go along. And he was an early relativist and affected, lots and lots of people. One of the guys that I treat in my book is Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Okay, of course, we all know Karl Marx and Charles Darwin. Darwin had profound detrimental impact on this country.
Darwin is probably the most influential man of the modern age. In fact, they've done surveys and found that the vast majority of people say Charles Darwin is the number one most powerful influence in the most number of people in the present day. Now, I would like to say Jesus Christ is, and I think if you look at the entire globe, you would say that Jesus Christ has had the most influence. But if you look at just the Western world over the last 150 years, and you survey people, you're going to find Charles Darwin had the most influence on the most people over the last number of years. Now, as it turns out, he was a sadist. He was insane. He suffered from multiple forms of insanity, and he confessed himself to be a sadist who enjoyed torturing small animals to death and really dreamed of killing and murdering people. And also, I think the most horrific thing about Charles Darwin, people need to understand, is he wrote a book called The Descent of Man, in which he talked about the necessity of eliminating certain races. And when he said that there's a necessity of eliminating certain races, in the paragraph that I treat in my book, in fact, I list out that long paragraph, and I say this is probably the worst paragraph, the most dangerous paragraph, the most horrific paragraph, the most evil paragraph ever written in any book in the history of mankind. And people need to know that paragraph. They need to know it virtually by heart. if they're ever going to stand up against the eugenics and the racism and the evolutionary racism that is predominant in the minds of men today. Charles Darwin was an extremely evil man, and I think he was ultimately the root of what happened with Adolf Hitler and the eugenics and the racist programs that developed out of the 1920s.
And the inspiration for Planned Parenthood.
Oh, yes. Yeah, throw that in, too.
And, you ask any, almost any college or university professor, what was the name of Charles Darwin's great work? And they will say The Origin of Species.
Yeah.
But they don't tell you the rest of the title.
No.
The preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. He was a racist.
Yep. Very important that people understand this kind of stuff, and because these are the most powerful, influential men of the modern age. And as Christians get educated, as we get educated and we educate our children, I think we might be able to salvage something of our children. So many of our children go to public schools, wind up in public universities, and I find them taking
they're educated into little commies.
Yeah. They're taking the wrong direction all the time.
And it's not that their teachers or instructors are members of the Communist Party. No, they have been indoctrinated into socialism, communism. They don't even know it. It's been going on for decades. They don't know any other way to think other than a socialistic, communistic worldview. On your list, Friedrich Nietzsche. Here's another sorry excuse
Nietzsche was the father of modern psychology. In fact, most psychology programs will link to Friedrich Nietzsche as the grandfather of their movement, and he was the first psychologist, called himself the first psychologist, but he had it in for Jesus Christ.
Yes, he's the one, he coined the phrase, God is dead.
Yes, he did. And he also wrote a book called The Antichrist, in which he positioned himself as the Antichrist. He said, I am Antichrist. I am against Christ. So he took a battle against Christ. Well, 3 months after he published the book, he went totally insane. And he was insane for the last 13 years of his life. So you pick the wrong fight. You don't pick a fight with the Lord of Lords and King of Kings.
Why don't they tell us about why don't they tell us that part in college?
Well,
that he went insane.
Because it's embarrassing to tell everybody that the grandfather of psychology was totally insane. That's one of the great ironies of all of history,
And what drove him to insanity? What was the book that he wrote?
It was called The Antichrist, a book in which he positioned himself as the Antichrist himself.
And he went insane.
Yeah.
He got demon-possessed.
Yep. And I think there were several that were actually possessed by Satan himself. I think Karl Marx was possessed by Satan himself. Nobody could have achieved as much power in their ideas and their influence over billions of people, China, USSR, Cuba, etc., even America to some extent. Nobody could have achieved that much power, that much influence without the aid of principalities and powers at the very, very highest echelons of the demonic world.
He was a Satanist. He was not an atheist. He was a Satanist.
He was a Satanist, right. In fact, I have quote after quote from his poetry and his prose where he acknowledges that he was in league with Satan himself. And he had taken on Satan's agenda of destruction, and it's amazing. I mean, I have the language in my book, and I realize that it's controversial, and my book is a challenge. I would dare people to read it. It's a difficult read in some ways. It's a page-turner in other ways, but you're going to see some sheer evil throughout it, where I swim into the worldviews and the lives of some of those evil men who have ever lived. And I detail the sorts of things that they taught and the sorts of things that they did.
Okay, but now the father of public education, who would speak against public education? Would you do it?
Oh, yeah, John Dewey. Dewey. And before that, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Mm-hmm.
John Dewey said that Jean-Jacques Rousseau had incredible influence upon him. So the links are undeniable. John Dewey, of course, raised in a Christian home, as almost every one of these were raised in a Christian home. That's why we call them apostates. And they become very dangerous men because they abandon the faith of their mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers. And John Dewey's parents were godly people. His mother was a godly evangelical Christian who would witness about Jesus to everybody she ran into. But he lost his faith in college, effectively. He was shamed out of it by G. Stanley Hall, his professor, who himself was raised in a Christian home. His parents wanted him to be a pastor, but sadly they sent him to university and then off to the liberal university in Germany. And as always, they go to the university and they manage to find some particular exit from the highway of orthodoxy and wind up in some strand of apostasy. And so that's what happened to G. Stanley Hall, and then G. Stanley Hall shamed John Dewey out of any belief in the true and living God, and John Dewey became probably the most outstanding atheist and the guy who penned the Humanist Manifesto 1 in 1933, I believe it was, and set the course for American public schools to be as secular and atheistic as they are today.
All right, let's. I've got about 2 minutes remaining. Let's jump forward in time. Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain.
Yeah. Yep, and I know that's a shocker to some, but Mark Twain was probably the strongest apologist against the Christian faith that America has ever seen. His book, Huckleberry Finn, probably the most popular book used in high school education, high school literature. And what I go at my book is the whole literature program in Christian schools and Christian colleges across America. We have been almost thoroughly infiltrated by humanist ideas and literature programs. Almost nobody has approached these things with as much critique as I have in my book. I take on Mark Twain. I take on Nathaniel Hawthorne's
what's in Huckleberry Finn that we should watch out for?
Well, Huckleberry Finn is a constant attack on the Christian church for its position on slavery in the southern states. And he mocks Christianity throughout. Huckleberry Finn himself is an atheist who is abandoning the faith and finding multiple reasons throughout his journey to oppose the Christian faith. He points out hypocrisy everywhere. Think of the Granger Fords, where they run into the Granger Fords who have the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress and everything. They go to Sunday school in the morning, and then they go and murder the living daylights out of each other on Sunday afternoon. I mean, his book is extremely powerfully, cynically against the Christian faith. And Mark Twain himself, I believe, turned out to be demon-possessed at the end. At the end of his life, within 2 years of dying, he wrote a book penning letters from Satan to the archangels and instructed his daughter not to publish the book ever because it would get him into trouble. It was finally published in the 1960s. It's one of the most acidic, horrific, evil books I think ever written by any human being in the history of mankind.
Wait a minute. Tell me this again. Mark Twain wrote a book called what?
It's called Letters from the Earth, in which he's penning letters from Satan himself to the archangels, Gabriel and Michael. And it's just a hair-raising, horrific story in which he's encouraging women to multiple adulterous relationships and so forth and so on. But wasn't Samuel Clemens kind of like a forerunner of pornography? Wasn't he? Well, pretty perverted old guy. Ernest Hemingway was probably fit that bill a little bit more. He wrote his first pornographic novels when he was 17 years old, and I have a whole section on Ernest Hemingway as well in the book. But these were all apostates, Hemingway or Mark Twain was raised in a Presbyterian home. He called himself a Presbyterian for many, many years. And Hemingway was raised in a nice little Baptist home, Wheaton College background. But they become some of the most horrific writers that maintain Nietzschean ideas and transcendentalist ideas and things that are eroding the Christian faith and destroying the Christian influence in culture and especially in literature. And this is why we need to engage the battle. In literature, the most liberal departments in Christian colleges today, almost without exception, are the literature department, the liberal arts department. And my book is intended to hopefully roll a hand grenade into the garden party on this one and encourage people to engage the battle of worldviews in liberal arts more than we ever have before. And I'm hoping that my book, Apostate, will accomplish this. I think we're losing because we keep losing the battle in the liberal arts classrooms again and again and again and again and again. And I think it's time to stop losing. All right, True News audience, if you want to deprogram your mind from a lot of stuff that was taught to you in school and college, you can start with Kevin's new book, and it is Apostate, The Men Who Destroyed the Christian West. You can get it at his website, generationswithvision.com. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate the work that you're doing. Thanks, Rick. Always appreciate it.
You're listening to True News, the End Time Newscast.